This is Rodinal, and one of the things I like to use it for is stand development. If you're unfamiliar, stand developing is when you take a developer, like Rodinal, dilute it by a lot, like 1 to 100 or 1 to 200, agitate it for the first 30 seconds, and then let it sit for an hour or so. There are several benefits of doing this. The first would be the simplicity. You don't have to be precise with your timings. If you're late by a few minutes, you're not going to hurt your film. Another benefit is the cost. For stand development, I normally dilute it to 1 to 100, and at that point you're using a negligible amount of developer. For example, if you paid 20 bucks for a 500 milliliter bottle of Rodinal, at a 1 to 100 dilution, you could develop about 166 rolls of 35 millimeter, which breaks down to about 12 cents a roll. And while it's possible to do a standard development with Rodinal diluted to 1 to 100, for such a high dilution, you're going to have to compensate by developing for a longer time. And I really don't want to do a standard development where I have to agitate at the top of every minute for 25 minutes or something. At that point, I'd rather just do one agitation, come back an hour later. Another reason why people like to do this is for the compensating development. That's essentially where the highlights and the shadows develop separately, allowing for more details in the high contrast scenes. And finally, the main reason why I like to use it is for the utility. You could develop pretty much anything with stand development. If you don't know the times or what kind of film you have, just stand develop it and you'll get something. And while all that sounds good, there are some important side effects to be aware of. The biggest is bromide drag. This is essentially where the bromide formed during the development slides off the film, causing uneven development. Another downside is that it takes an hour plus to develop. Standard development could take about 5 minutes or so, so if you're pressed for time, there are better options out there. But if you're not pressed for time, and if anything, if an hour is too short, I got options for you. This is what people call Coldinal. It's where you stand develop in the fridge for 24 hours. But for starters, it worked, but at least with this one roll, there is one big issue. There is this gradient in the development where the bottom half of the frame looks overdeveloped. It caused images to look like this. In some frames it's obvious, but in others it kind of blends into the scene. But surprisingly, it's not consistent. It's not in all of the frames, so I really don't know what's going on here. But if you ignore it, I do like how the images turned out. It's sharp, it has good details in the highlights and the shadows, so if I'm able to dial it in, I might have to try this more often. But after seeing these results, I did have a question. If I could develop film in the fridge, what about the freezer? So yeah, there's some problems here. First off, this was in the freezer for a month. Normally I would use plastic reels and tanks, but since I was putting this in the freezer, I didn't know how the plastic would hold up, so I opted for a metal tank and a reel. Over the years, I've hardly used metal reels, but I'm trying, but I still suck at using them. These blotches here are from when I misloaded the film onto the reel, and the film got stuck together during development. I don't know if you can see, but the edge of the film is also a little chewed up. That's just another sign of me having problems loading the film onto the metal reel. If you ignore the frames with the undeveloped smudges, you can see these weird wavy lines. I'm not sure what caused those, but it's interesting. Even with all that weirdness, it actually developed. I have negatives. I don't know how much of it being in the freezer versus it being developed for a month caused any of these issues, but the fact that I have something is a promising sign. So I tried it again. But this time I went for a week-long development, and it turned out a lot better. Just looking at the negatives, it looks fine, which is way more than I could have hoped for. I don't know if it was the shorter development that actually helped, or if it was something else that caused the problems from before. Regardless, this film was in a block of ice for a week, and it came out looking like this. But it's not perfect. From a distance it looks great, but when you take a closer look, you'll notice some strange things. There are blotches of uneven development. It's obvious in some scenes, but in others it kind of blends in. And of course I trichromed it. And here you could see where the uneven development manifests itself in these colorful blotches. The weirdness of these trichromes made me curious, so I shot a whole roll. Honestly, it doesn't look too bad. You get the occasional color smudges here and there, but overall, like, I expected worse. One thing I didn't mention is that the film was frozen and I had to thaw it somehow. I left it in the fridge for about 2 days and it was able to thaw, but that brings up the question of, did I actually develop it in the freezer or did I develop it as it was thawing out in the fridge? I don't know. I just thought it'd be important to mention though. Ultimately, what's the takeaway of all of this? I think developing in the fridge is a viable option, assuming I could work out on that weird gradient issue. And if you ever need to start developing a roll, but then have to go on a week-long vacation, I mean, I got a perfect solution for that. Otherwise, it's probably best to just stick with normal development.